When we look into the depths of the human heart, a fundamental question surfaces, one that has troubled philosophers since the dawn of thought. Are we born good, or are we inherently flawed, waiting for the right moment to reveal some deep-seated shadow? It is a question so primal, it speaks not just to our morality, but to the very architecture of our soul. We observe moments of effortless kindness, the stranger who offers help without expectation, or the parent sacrificing comfort for a child's joy. These acts seem to point toward an inherent luminosity, suggesting that perhaps goodness is simply our natural setting. Yet we also witness the opposite. The sudden betrayal whispered in secrecy, the sting of unwarranted envy, the casual cruelty found in passing judgment. These moments challenge any simple narrative of innate virtue. They force us to confront a stark contradiction. If goodness were automatic, why does it sometimes require such tremendous effort? Why does the impulse toward selfishness feel so effortlessly available? The ancient sages offered us contrasting blueprints for existence. Some posited that man is born good, but corrupted by society, that our pure nature must be protected from external vice. Others argued with equal fervor that we are inherently prone to darkness, and it requires constant discipline, a vigilant guard against the encroaching shadows of instinct. The debate has shaped civilizations, fueled wars, and defined laws. It remains one of humanity's enduring dilemmas. But perhaps this framing, good versus evil, is too simplistic, too binary to capture the messy richness of being human. To view us through such absolute terms is to strip away the essential complexity. We are not purely luminous spirits suspended above base instincts. We are a confluence of powerful forces constantly in tension with one another. Consider our internal landscape for a moment. It is not a neatly organized cabinet containing only good tools or only sharp knives. Rather, it is a vast, dynamic battlefield where different impulses clash. There is the impulse to connect, deeply and unconditionally. There is the same powerful pull toward self-preservation, sometimes at the expense of others. These instincts are neither morally pure nor inherently wicked. They are merely incredibly strong forces, demanding our recognition and careful management. The temptation often lies in believing that if we simply will ourselves to be better, if we just think hard enough about virtue, that goodness will magically manifest. But the path to ethical living is rarely a single, straight ascent of pure thought. It involves grit, friction, and acceptance of our inevitable imperfection. To explore this territory means accepting that our being is not defined by a fixed moral switch, but by continuous motion. We are always shifting, much like river water that takes the shape of its container without changing its essence. This constant flow suggests that our nature is not a static object to be discovered. Rather, it is a process, a practice. And this brings us inevitably to the profound weight of choice. If we cannot blame an inherent flaw or celebrate a preordained goodness, where does the locus of control truly rest? It rests squarely upon our decision point. We stand at crossroads in life, physical junctions on a dusty road, and invisible junctions within our own minds. At every one of these places, we are forced to choose a direction. The philosophy teaches us that while our impulses may be primal, our response is never involuntary. The animal reacts, the human responds. And this capacity for conscious, deliberate response, this freedom, is both the source of our greatest glory and our deepest terror. Because with this incredible power comes an overwhelming responsibility. We are defined less by what we feel in a moment of weakness, or by the shadow that threatens to consume us, and far more by how deliberately we choose to act when it is hardest. The true art of living, then, becomes not the search for a fixed, better nature, but the relentless discipline of redirection. It is acknowledging the darkness, the envy, the desire for recognition, the petty malice, not as something that possesses us, but as raw material that we must process and transform. It demands a radical honesty about ourselves. If we wish to move beyond this simple dichotomy of good or evil, we must first learn to observe the landscape of our own mind without judgment. We must become the inner observer, stepping back like an astronomer viewing the movements of distant planets. The emotions that flash through us, the searing anger, the paralyzing fear, the intoxicating rush of ego, these are not failures of character. They are merely data points, signals, warnings, powerful chemical reactions telling us something needs attention. The goal is not to eliminate these powerful feelings, for they are part of our operating system. The goal is to notice that we are feeling them and to create the crucial space between the stimulus and our reaction. That tiny fraction of a second is where all human freedom resides. It is the moment we pause before speaking, the breath we take before reacting, the choice to analyze rather than merely emote. This realization dismantles the myth of fixed identity. You are not simply your anger when it crests. You are not merely your comfort when it arrives. You are the space surrounding those fluctuating states. You are the continuous act of becoming a thoughtful being. This journey requires us to treat our nature not as something static we discover, but as a garden that must be perpetually tended. We pull the weeds of resentment and self-deception, and we nourish the growth of understanding. The answer, perhaps, is neither solely good nor purely bad. It lies in the magnificent, terrifying vastness of what we have the ability to choose, and the capacity for choice is the ultimate measure of our humanity. We spent time considering the grand question of our core being. Are we born into a state of potential purity, or are we burdened by an inherent flaw? The initial conversation moved us beyond simple labels, showing that human nature is not a binary switch. It is complex, fluid, and profoundly contradictory. We realized that simply having good impulses does not guarantee good action, nor do negative instincts necessarily lead to moral collapse. Instead, we began to see the vast landscape of our own internal life as a realm of powerful currents, each pulling us in a different direction. If nature is neither purely good nor purely evil, then what are these strong currents? They are simply impulses. They are drives. The sharp sting of envy when another succeeds, the seductive pull of resentment when justice seems far off, or the immediate comfort offered by small deceptions. These feelings are natural. They are echoes of our biological and social wiring. To treat them as purely bad is to miss their profound truth. They are merely energies that require understanding, not condemnation. The second chapter asks us to look at what we might call the shadow self. This is not some monster lurking in the dark corners of the mind. It is simply the part of us that feels inconveniently powerful, confusing, or embarrassing when exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. The shadow self represents our rawest instincts, those impulses born out of fear, inadequacy, survival needs, and deep-seated desires for recognition. When we are triggered, when our security, pride, or sense of belonging is threatened, these strong currents surface. They pull us toward reaction, toward quick judgment, toward the path of least internal resistance. Imagine standing at a confluence of rivers. One river flows with genuine compassion, another runs with jealous bitterness, a third moves swiftly with self-interest. At this point, we are not merely observers, we are immersed in the current, and our physical actions will follow the strength of the flow that takes hold. The temptation presented by these strong impulses is always convenience. It is easier to blame the neighbor for your own discomfort. It is safer to maintain a narrative about who you are, the victim or the perfect soul, than it is to face the terrifying reality that you might be impulsive, flawed, and deeply contradictory. This comfort zone of self-deception is where true moral difficulty begins. We must learn to distinguish between impulse and choice. An impulse is automatic. It requires no deliberation. It is a knee-jerk reaction to an external stimulus, a harsh word, an unexpected loss, a moment of comparison with another person's fortune. Choice, however, is the pause. It is the momentary interval between feeling and acting. It is in that suspended breath that our entire character is forged. The shadow self does not command us. It merely presents its raw offering. We have to greet it without judgment. When envy arises because a colleague receives praise you feel you deserve, your initial reaction might be dismissal or even subtle sabotage. The practice here is not to eliminate the feeling of envy. That emotion has roots in our shared mammalian wiring, but to observe it. To notice, there is the impulse of comparison again. I feel depleted by this perceived injustice. This act of internal noticing creates space. Space is the currency of freedom. Without it, we are slaves to reaction. With it, we can begin to build a conscious architecture for our being. We start treating these strong impulses not as proof of inherent evil, but as data points. They tell us where our vulnerabilities lie. Perhaps we fear abandonment most deeply. Maybe we crave external validation more than inner peace. The impulse is merely pointing toward an unmet need. To recognize the shadow self and its temptations is to accept that simply existing in the world involves grappling with these powerful undercurrents of flawed desire. We cannot live up to a perfect blueprint because such a thing does not exist in the messy reality of being human. Our struggle is therefore less about conquering an external demon and more about managing the formidable landscape within our own hearts. The goal is radical acknowledgement, accepting that some days we will be reactive, selfish, or petty. The wisdom lies not in achieving perfection, for that is a myth, but in how quickly and thoughtfully we acknowledge the descent and what corrective course of action we take afterward. This internal self-scrutiny, this willingness to stare directly into our own messy desires without flinching, is the true discipline. It is the commitment to seeing oneself fully, the momentary angel, the clumsy child, and the shadow beast all residing within one single continuous being. And only by owning this complexity can we ever claim genuine self-mastery. We have spent time examining the inner landscape of humanity. We looked at impulses that flare up in moments of weakness, and we named them envy, resentment, fear. These were not categorized as pure evil, but rather as raw energies, powerful forces within us that demand our attention. If you think this is merely an inventory of human failing, I ask you to consider something more profound. Because simply knowing these impulses exist does not change them. The true weight of understanding lies in the moment that choice arrives, the crossroads. The philosophical inquiry has always sought a single answer. Are we inherently good or fundamentally flawed? But wisdom tells us that such answers do not exist, and they certainly do not fit the complexity of the human spirit. Instead, there is an embrace of freedom itself. Freedom, in this context, is not merely the absence of chains. It is the overwhelming responsibility of definition. Imagine yourself standing at a juncture where two paths diverge sharply. One path promises comfort, perhaps a quicker return to the familiar warmth of resentment or judgment. The other stretches into an unknown expanse, a path that demands effort, patience, and radical self-control. It is here, in the space between these twin directions, that we find ourselves suspended by free will. The ancient thinkers understood this suspension intimately. They knew that simply having the capacity to choose was itself a burden, a monumental gift accompanied by equal parts dread and exhilaration. For if there were no choice, then our actions would merely be reactions, the predictable twitch of muscle or the automatic response driven by instinct. But because we are gifted with consciousness, we are cursed with deliberation. This is where the weight truly settles upon us. It does not reside in some cosmic blueprint etched into our DNA, nor is it dictated by our upbringing or the society that surrounds us. The responsibility of defining what a human being is rests entirely on the steady rhythm of your own ascent and descent. You are defined not by what you feel when the world disappoints you, but by how you decide to respond when failure feels inevitable. The temptation, I admit, is to look outward for justification, to point to circumstance, the economic pressure, the betrayal of a friend, the injustice witnessed on the streets, and say that those external forces explain the malice or at least mitigate the blame. This tendency offers a comforting illusion of inevitability. It whispers that you were merely following the current, simply reacting to unavoidable pressures. But free will demands we look deeper than the convenient scapegoat. It requires us to ask the difficult question: if all external factors were removed, the pressure, the disappointment, the fear, would the choice still lead down the path of avoidance? The moral courage required here is exhausting because it asks you to separate your conscious will from your deepest emotional tides. You must act not out of feeling wronged, but out of a chosen principle. The weight of choice becomes visible when we consider inaction. To choose nothing is itself a profound decision. It can be an evasion, a retreat into the apathy that feels momentarily safe. Yet even this surrender requires choosing the mantle of indifference over the labor of moral engagement. The emotional gravity of free will is vast because it means every single choice carries consequences, not just for ourselves, but for the weave of our relationships and the quality of the world around us. A small moment of self-discipline today might prevent a cascade of misjudgment years from now. A gentle refusal to engage in petty critique protects not only your own peace, but also the fragile dignity of another person. The initial struggle is one of recognition, recognizing that between the impulse, the sudden flare of anger, the urge to dismiss someone's worth, and the action, there exists a sacred, terrifying pocket of time. This pause is where our power resides. It is in this fractional sliver of consciousness that we insert judgment, intention, and therefore self-determination. The struggle against the default setting, the immediate reactive response honed by years of survival instinct or social conditioning, is humanity's great, lifelong athletic endeavor. We are constantly training a muscle, the muscle of deliberate consideration. It is exhausting because we are perpetually fighting gravity, the gravitational pull toward ease, comfort, and familiar blame. To accept this weight means accepting that there is no universal guarantee of goodness. There is only continuous practice. Our nature is not a destination to be achieved, nor is it a fixed state to be found beneath layers of regret or habit. It is, rather, an active verb, a continuous work in progress defined moment by moment, choice by choice. Embracing free will, then, means accepting that the ultimate definition of who you are belongs solely to you. It does not belong to your ancestors, nor to your critics, nor even to the fleeting emotional weather of your own heart today. It is a sacred and awesome burden, but it is also the source of all true dignity. We are, quite literally, authors of our own character, penning one difficult paragraph after another, until we complete the sprawling, complex epic that life intends us to write. We have spent this journey asking one of humanity's most enduring and profound questions. Are we born good, or are we fundamentally flawed? In the early chapters, we learned that simple labels fail us. Our nature is not a single constant color. It is a dynamic landscape, shifting with every sunrise and shadowed by unknown influences. We realized that impulses, even those difficult feelings like resentment or envy, are simply energies. They are natural responses to pain, unmet need, or perceived injustice. But energy itself holds no moral value. The struggle, therefore, resides not in what rushes through us, the thought, the sharp word, the sudden flash of anger, but in how we choose to respond when that current hits its peak. This is where our true character is forged, in that vital moment of delay. It is a small pause between feeling and action, but it is also everything. If we rush into response, we are ruled by reaction. If we pause, we engage the deliberate self. Today, we turn to a profound framework, the wisdom of Stoicism. They offer not answers to inherent nature, but radical tools for mastering the unpredictable chaos that surrounds us and within us. Stoic thought asks us to fundamentally divide the world into two categories. Everything falls into one of these bins, things we can control and things we cannot. This dichotomy is a quiet revolutionary concept. It does not ask us to change the outside world. Rather, it demands that we redraw the borders within ourselves. Consider the grand sweep of fate, the unpredictable actions of others, the sudden downturns of fortune. These are external realities. They are bound by forces far larger than our individual will, and demanding control over them is simply wishing for a magic wand to alter physics or human hearts. Such attempts lead only to despair. But look inward. Look at your own mind. What judgments do you make? How do you interpret an unexpected criticism? When another person disappoints you, what narrative do you tell yourself about it? These internal filters, these assessments of reality, are entirely yours. They belong exclusively to the realm of choice. This realization is profoundly liberating because it transfers the locus of control from the volatile world to the resilient fortress of your own mind. We cease fighting battles that were never meant for us to fight. The Stoics teach us that suffering does not come from external events themselves, but from our resistance to them. A harsh word spoken by a friend is merely sound vibration until we attach the meaning. It is an attack. It is shameful. It hurts deeply. It is the interpretation, the judgment of the event, that builds the emotional weight and the subsequent pain. If we practice stripping away those judgments, recognizing that this happened is separate from this means something terrible about me, then the events lose their power. They become simply neutral data points. It requires a constant redirection of focus. When anxiety grips us, pulling us toward worry over things out of our grasp, our health next year, the political stability of the world, the approval of others, the Stoic challenge is immediate and precise. Is this within your sphere of personal judgment? If the answer is no, we must consciously release the grip. This practice is not passive resignation, far from it. It is an active, muscular redirection of attention. We are choosing where to spend our limited energy. Taking what is fate, circumstance, or the flawed nature of others, and accepting it fully does not mean becoming cynical or apathetic. On the contrary, true acceptance is the precursor to disciplined action. If you fight reality, your effort will always be fighting against an invisible current. But if you accept that the riverbed is exactly where it needs to be, then you can learn to swim more powerfully within its currents. Acceptance becomes our most powerful ethical stance. This philosophy teaches us radical resilience. It suggests that human freedom lies not in achieving perfect outcomes, but in mastering our internal response mechanisms. We cannot command the world to be orderly or benevolent, yet we can insist that our own judgments remain calm and measured. This mastery is the ultimate definition of goodness, because it represents the alignment of will with reality. And when we integrate this Stoic understanding into the grand questioning of human nature, a profound peace emerges. Are humans naturally good? Not in some mythical, pristine sense. They are complex beings who struggle endlessly against the currents of fate and emotion. But if goodness is defined as the ability to exercise disciplined judgment, to choose reasoned response over panicked reaction, then we realize that our capacity for virtue resides entirely within this sphere of self-control. It is not a gift we receive, nor an inherent trait guaranteed at birth. It is a practice. It is the daily commitment to acknowledging what we cannot change, and dedicating all our ferocious willpower solely to refining how we choose to judge those things. That relentless effort, that steady acceptance of the messy reality, defines us as striving toward a profound and difficult self-mastery. We have spent time contemplating the deep architecture of our being. We looked at impulses, the flashes of envy, the sudden wave of resentment, and learned that these strong energies are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. They are simply powerful forces, raw and undifferentiated, urging us toward action without conscious consent. The greatest lesson we gathered was one of space, recognizing the pause between the visceral jolt of impulse and the reasoned formation of a choice. This moment of stillness is where our true nature resides. It is not in the reaction itself, but in how we choose to respond when that pressure mounts. Yet, acknowledging this internal struggle is only half the journey. If our impulses are merely raw energy waiting for direction, then the crucial next step is learning how to observe them without being consumed by them. We must become observers of ourselves. Imagine standing at a great distance from the self, not physically far, but mentally removed. The aim is not suppression. True mastery never comes from forcing an emotion away, like pushing clouds out of the sky. It comes from noticing its shape, acknowledging its passage, and allowing it to drift by. This act of inner observation requires a profound shift in perspective, a commitment to radical self-witnessing. We must treat our emotions not as defining parts of who we are, but like passing weather patterns overhead. Anger is just a storm front. Sadness is the heavy fog. Neither state defines your permanent geography. By observing them this way, they lose some of their tyrannical power over you. They cease to be commands and become mere information. The inner observer views the mind as an external object, a vast, complex theater where life's dramas are continuously being staged. You realize that the narratives playing out inside your head, the constant loop of worry about tomorrow or regret concerning yesterday, are not necessarily reflections of immutable truth. They are merely stories the mind constructs to give meaning to raw experience. The struggle we face is convincing ourselves to step back and simply watch this process unfold. We tend to identify so fully with our thoughts that they feel like facts about reality, when in truth, they are only electrical impulses passing through neural pathways. To observe means asking, is what I am experiencing right now an objective fact, or is it my judgment upon an event? This separation, this critical gap between the raw stimulus and your personal interpretation of it, is arguably the greatest power available to human consciousness. This observer position grants incredible freedom. If you realize that the powerful pang of jealousy, for example, is merely a thought pattern being generated, rather than a fundamental truth about your worthiness, then you gain the ability to choose what story you will believe. You stop having to react immediately and start allowing yourself the luxury of contemplation. The purpose of this self-witnessing is not therapeutic comfort, it is philosophical rigor. It is a disciplined practice that trains the mind's muscle until the default state shifts from reactivity to reflection. We move away from the myth of instantaneous reaction, which assumes we are puppets controlled by emotion, toward the recognition of conscious agency. You begin to understand that every emotional intensity, every sudden surge of protective rage or paralyzing fear is an invitation, and signal asking you to pause and examine its source. What assumption is this feeling protecting? Or conversely, what illusion is it sustaining? When we practice this observation daily, we dismantle the tendency to personalize every passing emotion. We learn that thoughts are transient visitors, not permanent residents. They come, they gather weight for a moment, and then they must inevitably change or dissipate. This realization, that nothing internal remains fixed forever, is profoundly liberating. It dismantles the brittle identity structures we build up around our perceived strengths and weaknesses. The inner observer is essentially your most discerning editor. It scrutinizes the unedited rough drafts of your emotional life. It doesn't judge the bad chapters, nor does it blindly celebrate the good ones. It merely notes their existence and helps you realize that the full volume, the entirety of your experience, is something constantly in motion. This detachment is not coldness, far from it. Instead, it is the deepest form of compassion for the complicated, messy human animal that you are, recognizing that every struggle, every painful impulse, holds valuable data waiting to be processed. To become the inner observer is to embrace complexity itself. It means accepting that being human does not mean being merely good, nor solely bad. It means inhabiting the entire spectrum, the gentle kindness, the biting resentment, the thoughtful consideration, and the reckless urge. And in recognizing all these colors within your own mind's palette, you are finally free to choose which one will define the action of your hands tomorrow. We have spent our time asking difficult questions. We asked if we were born good, or if darkness was etched into the blueprint of our being. We explored the shadows within ourselves, acknowledging those strong impulses, the envy, the sharp resentment, that often whisper to us in private moments. If we thought that humanity was defined by a single moral color, good or bad, we would find ourselves trapped in a simple and false dichotomy. Such a belief gives us the comfort of certainty, but it strips us of our humanity. It suggests that there is either perfection awaiting discovery or absolute corruption waiting to erupt. But man, as we see it, is not defined by fixed material. We are not statues carved with immutable virtue and vice. If our nature were a stone then once set, it could never change. Its moral character would be sealed at birth. But the flow of existence denies us such stasis. Think instead of water. Water does not claim one single form. It flows around obstacles, gathering in different basins, taking on the shape of whatever container holds it. Its essence remains liquid and adaptive, yet its appearance is always shifting. This fluidity must be our deepest realization about ourselves. The idea of a fixed self, a permanent, unchanging me that possesses an inherent state of goodness or evil, is perhaps the most potent myth we tell ourselves. It is the anchor that prevents us from realizing our true potential for becoming. We are not essence. We are process. We are not defined by who we were yesterday, nor necessarily by how we felt in a moment of weakness last week. We are the continuous act of moving toward something better than where we began. To grasp this concept requires a shift from external judgment to internal observation. It demands that we understand that the self is less like a solid object and more like a current river, forever running through changing landscapes of thought and feeling. Some moments are calm and clear, others are violent with the rush of passion or fear. But the river itself, the sheer process of moving from one point to another, is constant. The river does not accuse its own flow for having ripples. The consequence of believing in a fixed identity is paralyzing. If I believe that my fundamental self is flawed, then every mistake I make confirms this myth, and I resign myself to the perceived permanence of my shortcomings. I become trapped by a false blueprint. But if we accept that identity itself is provisional, that the me we are today is simply a confluence of yesterday's choices, today's reactions, and tomorrow's intention, then suddenly, every moment becomes an opportunity for radical self-reinvention. The failure ceases to be a verdict on our soul. It simply becomes data for the next choice. The myth of fixed identity dissolves when we realize that consciousness is not merely contained within us. It is the lens through which all of existence passes. Our deepest power lies in acknowledging this interpretive capacity. It means recognizing that a feeling, no matter how strong, anger, fear, despair, is not a statement of fact about who we are. It is simply an energy passing through our mind. This realization brings with it immense freedom, but also profound responsibility. If nothing is fixed, then everything rests upon the quality and intention of the next breath, the next word, the next considered action. We must cultivate the habit of intellectual humility. Humility not as weakness, but as a radical acceptance that we do not yet know the whole story of ourselves, that we are still learning to write the script. The discipline required is one of constant vigilance against self-mythologizing. Whenever an old narrative arises, I am impatient, I am incapable, I always react this way. We must pause and observe it, treating that narrative simply as a thought, unvalidated by emotion or history. We become skilled at questioning the certainty of our own definitions. The weight we place on who we are often outweighs the weight of what we actually do. But in philosophy, wisdom teaches us to shift this balance entirely. Our true nature is not something we uncover. It is something we relentlessly craft through conscious practice. It is built moment by deliberate moment, choice by deliberate choice. We carry within us the capacity for both light and shadow because we are fundamentally composites, a mixture of energies, instincts, experiences, and choices. And this lack of fixed definition is not a defect. It is our greatest strength. It means that there is always room for growth, always scope for repentance, and unending opportunity for becoming a better version of the person standing here right now. We are infinite work in progress. We have journeyed through the delicate geography of self. We learned that our nature is not a fixed stone, but flowing water, shifting and adapting with every choice we make. We found freedom in acknowledging that we are processes, perpetually becoming, rather than finished products defined by some inherent blueprint. If nothing defines us more profoundly than our ability to choose, then perhaps the weight of that choice cannot be borne alone. It reaches outward, defining not just who we are to ourselves, but how we interact with the vast, complex landscape of other souls. We must shift our gaze now from the internal battlefield to the space between selves. This is where understanding begins, and understanding does not come through pure logic or cold observation. It arrives via a bridge constructed of shared experience, empathy. To be empathetic means more than merely feeling bad for someone else. It is the profound act of stepping out of the confines of our own skin, imagining the reality that exists in another person's shoes. A reality built of invisible pain, unseen struggle, and unshared vulnerability. It is an intellectual and emotional feat, demanding us to suspend our natural impulse toward judgment. Our natural inclination, honed by survival, is often to categorize. This behavior is good, that character flaw is bad. Empathy forces a momentary halt to that swift judgment. It demands curiosity over condemnation. The capacity for empathy reveals the most profound question about human nature. Does it require us to judge others to understand them? Or can understanding exist in a space of pure, radical acceptance? If we accept this notion, then goodness cannot be defined by an internal checklist. The absence of envies or resentments, perhaps. Goodness must instead be measured by our willingness to extend grace when none is owed. It requires us to see the intricate, often desperate web of causality that leads a person to the actions that disturb us. Consider the cycle of perceived failure and resulting action. We tend to observe an act, a sharp word, a betrayal, a careless disregard, and immediately apply our accumulated wisdom. This person is flawed, they are untrustworthy. This judgment, while quick and perhaps comforting in its certainty, stops the conversation dead. It closes the door on understanding. But empathy whispers a different narrative. It asks us to pause before that final verdict. Before labeling the action as simply bad, we must consider the originating pressure. What invisible weight, what historical hurt, what unmet need might have shaped that difficult response? We begin to treat the transgression not as an indictment of the soul, but as a symptom, a loud, desperate signal from a wound. This shift in focus is radical. It changes our moral calculus. Instead of asking, what is wrong with this person, we must learn to ask, what has happened to them that caused them to act this way? The second question opens up an entire universe of human struggle, a history far richer and infinitely more complex than the single moment's misstep allows us to perceive. The consequence of true empathy is that our own definition of good expands dramatically. It cannot be a narrow, self-contained circle. It must become vast enough to encompass contradiction, misunderstanding, and systemic pain. Goodness becomes less about moral purity, the mythical perfect state, and more about compassionate awareness. It is the understanding that every human being, in their moment of distress, is fighting a battle we cannot fully see. The challenge for us, therefore, is constant vigilance against intellectual arrogance. It is easy to believe that because we have done the inner work, the self-observation, the acceptance of our own messy nature, that we have earned the right to dispense judgment on others. This belief is perhaps the most corrosive poison to genuine empathy. The bridge between selves does not allow for a master and a subject. It only allows for two flawed beings recognizing the shared reality of their vulnerability. Our highest development, this deepest form of moral maturity, lies in our capacity to extend ourselves to that point. Acknowledging that the roots of another person's struggle might look alarmingly similar to the quiet, unseen wounds within our own heart. This realization demands a continuous discipline. It means replacing the sharp edge of you with the soft curve of us. To truly understand nature, human nature, is not just to categorize its impulses, but to feel the gravity of them, the physical pull they exert on all who cross their path. And this is why compassion must become our primary filter for judgment. It is the necessary acknowledgement that before we judge a life, we should first dedicate ourselves to understanding it as an ongoing, profound narrative shaped by forces beyond our immediate control. Our moral journey continues not by building higher walls around ourselves, but by building increasingly strong, resilient bridges toward one another. We have spent time contemplating the deep architecture of the human spirit. We questioned whether our design was fundamentally good or stained by darkness. What we learned, inevitably, is that nature itself is neither a monolithic virtue nor a congenital sin. It is something far more fluid, far more complex. It is potential. a wild energy, inherently messy, caught between the impulse toward connection and the instinct for self-preservation. This understanding leads us now to a warning, a critical insight into how we process what we have learned about ourselves. We have traveled a long way, examining the deep currents of the human heart. We learned that goodness is not an innate endowment, nor is vice a fixed curse. Instead, we found ourselves standing on shaky ground, suspended between the power of impulse and the clarity of choice. The journey has taught us that to understand ourselves is merely to observe them without judgment, recognizing that our true selves are never completed. They are perpetual acts of becoming. But understanding, no matter how profound, remains only a mental exercise until it becomes embodied action. To grasp the concept of self-mastery while remaining seated in quiet contemplation is like holding water with cupped hands. It is fleeting. True philosophy must spill out onto the hard ground of daily life. This is where the theory meets the discipline. We must move beyond simply observing the mind and translate that observation into a concrete, relentless practice. Virtue, we realize, is not a sudden illumination or a moment of grand sacrifice. It is instead something far more quiet, far less dramatic, and infinitely harder. It is the accumulation of tiny, almost invisible disciplines. The philosophical understanding of free will, while liberating on paper, can be daunting when faced with the weight of actual consequence. We are told we have total accountability for our choices, but life rarely presents itself as a series of clean crossroads. It often unfolds as a messy confluence of obligations, conflicting desires, and unpredictable human behavior. And in that mess, it is easy to revert to old habits. The comfortable quick fix of blame, the soothing lie of it was unavoidable. The deepest insight we have gained must now become our daily routine, our automatic response when the pressure builds. We learned how to step back from our emotions, to treat them like passing weather systems rather than defining realities. But stepping back is not enough. We must also know what to do with the newly acquired space of awareness. That silence between stimulus and response is the most precious commodity we possess, because it is within that gap that genuine choice resides. This means transforming abstract ideals, such as be more courageous or act with perfect empathy, into tangible rituals. It means accepting that self-improvement will not come in grand salvos of epiphany, but through micro-adjustments repeated thousands of times over the span of years. Think of a master craftsman, honing his skill not on a monumental statue, but on the ceaseless, minute scraping of stone against steel, day after repetitive day. This is the radical shift required. We must stop viewing morality as a destination and start seeing it solely as muscle memory. Virtue becomes less an intellectual concept to be understood and more a physical practice to be performed. It demands routine honesty, the willingness to admit when you are wrong, even if doing so costs you status or comfort in the short term. The temptation is always toward ease. The easy path allows us to outsource our moral decisions. We blame traffic congestion for our impatience, we blame a colleague's mistake for our outburst, and we blame fate entirely for the disappointments of life. But this chapter demands that we reclaim ownership of the inner landscape. We must confront the possibility that much of what we criticize in others, their petty jealousy, their laziness, their cruelty, is actually a reflection of the unaddressed sloppiness within ourselves. The discipline starts at the edges. When you are tired, when you are hungry, when your attention wanes, and when no one is watching. These unremarkable moments are the truest tests of character, because they do not provide the dramatic context that allows us to feel virtuous. They simply require us to choose virtue in its smallest form. This requires a meticulous inventory of our internal habits. What narratives do we repeat to ourselves when we fail? Do we immediately jump to self-pity, or do we pause and ask, what did I learn here? When we are confronted with disagreement, is our immediate instinct to defend our ego, or to truly seek the opposing perspective? The struggle here is exhausting because it rejects the quick comforts of assumption. It demands that we approach every single day as if it were a lesson in Stoic discipline, a living seminar where every interaction, every decision, and every internal monologue serves to either strengthen or weaken our moral sinew. We must cultivate what Seneca called active contemplation. This is not simply thinking about virtue when we are bored. It is actively visualizing moments of conflict, the person who speaks carelessly to you, the setback that feels deeply personal, and preemptively running through virtuous responses. What would the most temperate, resilient self do in this precise scenario? By doing this mental rehearsal, we diminish the power of surprise and emotional hijack when life inevitably presents us with real-world chaos. The cumulative weight of these small actions builds what character philosophers understood as excellence. It is not a glorious quality that shines out suddenly. It is the consistent low hum of right action. It is waking up and deciding, before the demands of the day begin, to commit to clarity over convenience and effort over ease. The disciplined life does not promise freedom from suffering, for external forces will always continue to buffet us with misfortune and disappointment. But it promises something far more valuable: internal resilience. The ability to meet the world's turbulence not with reflexive panic or defensive anger, but with measured reflection. This continuous commitment to ethical self-improvement is our truest form of freedom, for it means that even if we cannot control the events unfolding around us, we retain absolute sovereignty over the quality of our response. We have journeyed far from the simple question of whether humanity begins inherently good or inherently wicked. We learned that the nature of man is not a single, static substance, but rather an unending flow, a continuous field shaped moment by deliberate moment. The myths of fixed identity and innate purity prove to be far more fragile than we assumed. If our character is not written into us at birth, nor predetermined by some cosmic ledger of fate, then what guides our deepest impulses? What gives shape and direction to the immense, volatile energies that rise up within us? The rage, the sudden surge of jealousy, the chilling depth of fear. This leads us now to a profoundly different kind of examination: the role of emotion. For too long, we have treated intense feeling as merely a fault, a stain upon the otherwise noble slate of the soul. We view deep sadness or explosive anger as evidence of deficiency, signs that something fundamentally wrong resides within our core. But what if these powerful emotions are not flaws at all? What if they are sophisticated warning lights? What if they are signals, loud, often alarming, but ultimately informative? Like a fever spiking in the body to warn of infection, emotion might be the mind's natural alarm system, designed not for condemnation, but for survival and self-preservation. The initial reflex when we feel overwhelming distress is usually two things: either to suppress it entirely, to bury the feeling beneath layers of forced composure, or to react violently, letting it consume us in a spectacular flash. In both cases, we remain reactive, living out of habit, instinct, and emotional momentum. The philosophical challenge, therefore, is learning the subtle art of reception. How do we greet a powerful emotion not as an enemy force requiring eradication, but as a message demanding decoding? This requires us to suspend our usual judgment. We must pause and ask a different question entirely. Instead of asking myself, am I bad for feeling this rage? Or should I feel this fear? The inquiry must shift to, what is this emotion trying to tell me? What vulnerability is it highlighting? From what perceived threat is my deepest sense of self attempting to protect me right now? Consider the raw heat of anger. Often, we interpret anger as pure malice or failure of control. Yet, underlying that burning sensation lies a desperate need for boundary maintenance. Anger often flares when our personal boundaries have been violated, when someone has crossed a line we feel is essential to our dignity, or ignored a profound truth about ourselves. It is not the anger itself that is inherently damaging. It is what we do with the energy of the anger without first understanding its source. Think also of deep, paralyzing fear. We tend to equate fear solely with physical danger, the sudden predator, the harsh storm. But emotional fear often springs from more subtle internal threats. The fear of abandonment, the fear of inadequacy, the fear of being unseen or misunderstood. When this profound fear grips us, it is a desperate attempt by our psyche to warn us that an essential relational need is unmet. It is telling us to slow down, to pause the forward momentum until we have reassurance. This process demands immense intellectual humility. We must stop treating emotions like simple data points, good or bad, useful or useless. Instead, we must treat them like complex meteorological systems. They are forces of nature that require respect and careful study. They cannot simply be wished away. They must be understood in their totality. This reframing represents a monumental shift from the teachings of mere self-control. Stoicism taught us to control our judgments. This step asks us to understand the logic of the judgment itself, the emotional scaffolding built around a particular belief about safety, value, or belonging. The emotion acts as the urgent alarm, and the internal monologue is the flawed interpretation of that warning. The greatest trap we fall into is accepting the superficial reading. We hear the scream of distress and immediately jump to defensive action. Fight, flight, or freeze. But the wisdom lies in maintaining the gap, the sacred space between the intense feeling and the resulting action. That space is where true freedom resides. It is the quiet moment when you realize that while the fire of emotion is real, it does not automatically dictate your response. We must train ourselves to identify the protective core beneath the emotional storm. Is this resentment really about a past insult, or is it echoing an older wound, a deeper sense of having been unimportant? Is this intense jealousy merely about a perceived loss of connection, reminding us of a foundational need for belonging? The emotion becomes a biological radar system, constantly scanning our environment for risks, whether those risks are physical dangers or subtle breaches in emotional trust. Our task is to become the calm observer that calibrates that radar, acknowledging the warning without panicking, and identifying the true source of the signal. This realization dismantles much of the judgment we have applied to ourselves and others. When we see anger not as pure wickedness, but as a highly potent cry for dignity, or fear not as weakness, but as an overactive protector, our capacity for understanding blossoms. We move away from labeling the person, "You are angry," towards acknowledging the systemic state, "Your need for boundaries feels threatened." This subtle shift changes everything. The self-mastery we seek is therefore not about eliminating passion, for that would be to deny the essential vibrancy of life itself. True mastery, instead, is the ability to keep all passions fully illuminated, acknowledging their intensity, accepting their origin, and gently allowing them to pass without letting them dictate a harmful action. The emotion does not define us, only our choice in response to it does. We have traveled through the difficult terrain of the self. We questioned if our nature is fixed, whether we are fundamentally wired for good, or whether a deep-seated darkness awaits us at every turn. We learned that answering with a simple yes or no would be an act of intellectual laziness. Instead, we discovered something far more complex. Human existence is not a blueprint. It is a continuous performance, defined moment by conscious effort. The journey demanded that we look inward, to observe the shadow impulses, the sudden flare of resentment, the sharp bite of envy, and acknowledge them without condemnation. We realized these urges are merely strong energies, automatic reactions in a complex world, not statements on our soul's permanent quality. True growth began in the quiet pause between the impulse and the action. We embraced the profound weight of choice. We came to understand that free will is not a gentle gift, but a heavy, glorious responsibility. Every single day presents us with these invisible crossroads, demanding nothing less than our absolute accountability for where we choose to step. This realization forced us to look past external circumstances and take ownership of our internal responses. Our philosophical path then turned to acceptance, drawing deep lessons from the Stoics. We learned the vital discipline of separating what we can control from what we cannot. The fury at fate, the frustration with others' choices, these are burdens we mistakenly carry on our shoulders. Genuine freedom was found in directing all our attention solely to our judgments and our reactions. We trained ourselves to become inner observers, to stand back from the roaring river of emotion and simply witness it passing. We learned that merely observing a powerful feeling, like rage or despair, diminishes its power over us. It creates a vital space between the stimulus and the response, allowing us to choose our next move instead of merely reacting. This constant self-witnessing was revolutionary because it dismantled the myth of the fixed identity. We started seeing ourselves not as solid, unchangeable objects, not I am an angry person or I am a selfish person, but as flowing water, always shifting, always adapting, and constantly being remade by the confluence of our thoughts. Our true self is revealed only in the stream of our actions, moment after deliberate moment. And then we turned outward. We discovered empathy. This was not simply feeling sad for someone else. It was an act of radical intellectual humility. It meant suspending judgment entirely and attempting to understand the landscape of another soul's struggle. Compassion required us to ask a different question. Instead of what is wrong with this person, we had to ask, what has happened to them? This expanded our concept of goodness beyond moral purity. It became an acknowledgement of shared vulnerability across all humanity. The path then warned us about the insidious trap of judgment. Labels are weapons. They convince us that a person or even ourselves can be contained by one single word, a name, a role, an accusation. To judge from instinct is to merely perpetuate the cycle of reactive pain. To truly understand requires the sustained effort of deep listening and compassionate awareness. We learn that virtue is not a flash of lightning. It is sweat equity. It is the slow accumulation of tiny, almost invisible choices made repeatedly under mundane pressure. It is choosing honesty when silence would be easier, or accepting hardship gracefully when resistance feels safer. Moral growth became recognized as an exhausting but necessary daily discipline. This disciplined practice led us to examine our emotions with rigorous scrutiny. We began seeing powerful feelings like anger and fear not as inherent flaws to be suppressed, but as vital warning lights, signals pointing toward a vulnerability or an unmet need. They were complex messages demanding decoding, not violent suppression. The lesson was profound. Understanding the signal allowed us to transform reactive outburst into measured choice. And this brings us to forgiveness. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It is mistakenly believed that it requires some grand gesture of emotional outpouring, that we must feel pure warmth for the person who wronged us, or even forget the pain entirely. This expectation is a cruel and exhausting trap. If we wait for the feeling of forgiving to arrive before we act, we may wait forever. The truth, the ultimate self-mastery revealed here, is that forgiveness is not an emotion. It is an intentional decision. It is a choice made in your mind, independent of how you feel in your heart. To forgive someone means deciding that their debt to them is nothing more important than your own peace. Think of resentment. Resentment is not contained within the other person. It lives only inside you. It is like toxic bile, slowly poisoning the wellspring of your own spirit. By holding on to bitterness, by keeping score and recalculating debts, you are choosing to become a prisoner in a cell built entirely from yesterday's hurts. You allow that past action to dictate your present emotion. The choice to forgive, therefore, is an act of radical self-liberation. It is refusing to let another human being continue to control the quality and duration of your inner peace. It is reclaiming your emotional sovereignty. It means acknowledging, this person's mistake does not define my right to happiness or tranquility. It is the ultimate severing of a psychic rope, allowing yourself and them both the dignity of a new beginning. A clean slate that requires no magical forgetting, only profound acceptance. The final, gentle insight is perhaps the most comforting yet challenging. There is no perfect human blueprint. You are not meant to be flawless. We are contradiction wrapped in flesh. We are capable of the highest acts of grace and the lowest moments of selfishness. This messy, imperfect nature is not a weakness. It is the very source of our profound capacity for growth. Our story concludes not with an answer about whether we are good or bad at birth. It concludes with recognition. That goodness is simply the consistent habit of showing up for yourself and others, choosing awareness over reaction, choosing disciplined peace over immediate relief, and choosing self-mastery above all else. We define our nature entirely through the quiet discipline of forgiveness, accountability, and continuous care. We have traversed deep into the heart of what it means to be human. We began with a simple, deceptively difficult question. Are we inherently good or are we destined for darkness? Throughout these explorations, we have learned that such a clean answer is an illusion. Humanity resists simple labels. It is not a binary choice between virtue and vice. Rather, it is a complex equation, a dynamic interplay of contradiction, strength, weakness, and profound potential. This wisdom leads us to the most liberating realization yet. Perfection is not a prerequisite for being human. Imperfection, perhaps, is its very defining characteristic. For so long, we have approached our own nature with an unspoken demand for flawlessness. We seem to carry within ourselves an imagined blueprint, a myth of the ideal self that must be realized. But what if that blueprint does not exist? What if the quest for a fixed state is itself the deepest trap? In examining everything from the temptation of envy to the profound peace found in radical forgiveness, our journey has consistently pointed us back to a single truth. We are processes. We are narratives, constantly unfolding, forever moving, never settled. We are not solid objects with unchanging moral foundations. We are rather like rivers, always flowing, always adapting to the terrain they meet. To accept this fluidity is perhaps the greatest philosophical gift we can give ourselves. It means letting go of the fear that if we make a mistake, we have failed irrevocably. Instead, every misstep, every moment of contradiction becomes merely data, a piece of information illuminating the path to wiser action. We are allowed to be messy. We are allowed to waver. This is not surrender. It is profound self-acceptance. It is recognizing the inherent messiness of consciousness itself. Consider the pressure to define ourselves by one singular, defining virtue. Society loves certainty, and our own internal dialogue often demands a clear label. Good person, bad person, morally upright, flawed soul. But life rarely provides such neat categories. We can be fiercely loving in private and terribly dismissive in public. We can possess moments of startling wisdom followed by bouts of sheer, impulsive foolishness. This contradictory nature is not evidence of failure. It is the undeniable proof of our deep, vibrant complexity. It is what makes us alive. The greatest stumbling block for the learner of self-mastery is often the attachment to a desired identity. We want to be virtuous, as if virtue were a costume we can put on and never take off. But true virtue is not about achieving a static state. It is about the continuous effort toward excellence, moment after passing moment. Think of philosophy not as a destination reached by intellectual decree, but as an endless field of practice, like a vast garden that requires constant tending. Our human equation demands that we shed the weight of fixed identity. It asks us to observe ourselves with the gentle curiosity of an anthropologist studying a fascinating, erratic creature. When anger flares up, we do not ask if we are an angry person, for that label confines us and makes us predictable. Instead, we ask, what signal is this emotion sending? What unacknowledged vulnerability does it represent right now? When resentment builds, we do not declare ourselves a resentful soul, but we observe the tightness in our chest, the slight cooling of our vision, asking, what unmet need does this resistance guard? This process requires a radical shift from self-judgment to self-investigation. It demands that we treat our internal struggles, our envy, our fear of rejection, our tendency toward procrastination, not as personal moral failings, but as predictable outputs of our current understanding and limited perspective. They are merely mechanisms running on flawed, yet vital, software. The wisdom inherent in imperfection is profound freedom. It frees us from the tyranny of past mistakes and the terror of future failures. If we accept that being human means constantly containing multitudes, the desire for justice alongside the taste for indulgence, the love for connection alongside the need for fierce solitude, then our sense of moral obligation changes entirely. Our goal ceases to be achieving perfection, a goal that is ultimately impossible and exhausting. Instead, our goal becomes increasing our capacity for conscious response. This means embracing the inherent contradiction. It means accepting that today we may exercise tremendous discipline in our judgment of others, yet tomorrow we might fail spectacularly in managing a small moment of irritation. This pendulum swing is not failure. It is the rhythm of growth itself. Progress is measured by the acknowledgement of the slip and the subsequent choice to try again with more awareness. We are constantly refining our own moral calculus. We are building muscle memory for kindness. We are developing the reflex to pause before reactivity. We are learning that the weightiest ethical choices are rarely those played out in dramatic moments, but those mundane encounters, the slight exaggeration of a story at dinner, the unreturned email, the decision to simply walk away from a conflict when you could easily win it through argument. These small junctures, repeated day after day, define the architecture of our character. The true masterpiece of human life is not the polished statue of virtue, but the living, breathing process of becoming. We are defined by the ongoing act of revision, the continuous choice to regard ourselves as work in progress. Let us therefore approach this marvelous and messy existence with tenderness, not judgment. Be compassionate with your own limits, for they are simply indicators pointing toward where deeper self-understanding must begin. We are the editors of our own souls, holding the pen, making revisions, chapter by deliberate chapter, turning the chaotic script of instinct into the unfolding epic poem of conscious will. This is not the end of the journey, but it is a profoundly liberating pause. Here, in this understanding of imperfection, lies our greatest strength. We are resilient precisely because we know how to break and rebuild ourselves again, over and over, guided only by the quiet commitment to be slightly better than we were before. That commitment, that simple return to conscious effort, is the most sublime human poetry. We have traveled through these vast territories of the self. We looked at the whispers of instinct in Chapter 2, acknowledging the shadowed energy that lives within us. We faced the immense weight of choice, learning that to be human is to carry a profound responsibility in every moment. Then we sought refuge in Stoicism, finding peace by drawing lines in the sand, the things outside our grasp and the judgments entirely within our control. We practiced stepping back from the rushing current of emotion. We learned how to observe thoughts not as facts, but as temporary phenomena, like clouds passing across a vast sky. This inner witnessing gave us a sacred space, a pause between stimulus and reaction. It was here that we started to dismantle the myth of fixed identity, the comforting yet false idea that we are simply what we were yesterday. We realized that self is not an object, but a continuous act of becoming. Our journey then led us outward, requiring us to extend this profound self-understanding to others. We found compassion not through mere feeling, but through the radical suspension of judgment. It was acknowledging another person's story, the unseen struggles and vulnerabilities that shaped them into who they are today. This empathy taught us that good is rarely a simple category. It is instead an act of deep, humble recognition of shared humanity. We understood that judgment itself is a trap, a quick defensive mechanism that shrinks both the judge and the judged. To label, to call someone good or evil, is to limit their potential, to hold them captive within our own limited perception. And this brought us to virtue, which we saw was not an innate gift bestowed by destiny. Rather, it is discipline. It is a series of small, often invisible acts of willfulness, choosing honesty when silence would be easier, picking the difficult word instead of the convenient lie, showing kindness even when it costs you something tangible. The final lesson, we discovered, was about transforming our relationship with intense emotion. We learned that feelings like anger or fear are not flaws to be suppressed, but rather signals. They are urgent whispers from a deeper part of ourselves, warning us that a boundary has been crossed, or an essential need remains unmet. The true mastery is in listening to the signal without acting upon it impulsively. It is translating raw emotional energy into intellectual understanding. And perhaps nothing synthesized these concepts more completely than forgiveness. We came to understand that holding onto resentment, that burning grievance against another person's actions or words, is not a punishment inflicted on them, but a cage we build for our own hearts. Forgiveness, therefore, is not an emotion at all. It is the ultimate act of self-liberation. It is the conscious decision to reclaim your own peace from the debt owed by another soul. If there is one overarching truth that must settle in the heart tonight, it is this: nature itself offers us no definitive answer. The debate of whether we are born good or evil is ultimately irrelevant because it presupposes a static state. It implies a starting point and an end point. But human life is anything but static. We are rivers, constantly moving, reshaping ourselves with every ripple, navigating the rocks and embracing the currents that flow past. The profound realization, the synthesis of everything we have discussed, is this: our nature is not something discovered. It is something crafted. It is an architectural project performed entirely by us. We do not inherit a moral blueprint from birth or destiny. Instead, every moment presents us with raw materials, impulses, external chaos, fleeting emotions, and the deep pain of other people's mistakes. And we have the singular power to choose how those materials are used. Crafting your nature means embracing the contradiction. It means accepting that you will fail. You will stumble into moments of self-pity, petty judgment, or regrettable reaction. This is not a sign of failure. It is merely data, information about the present state of your practice. Growth is not a straight ascent to an untouched peak. It is the messy, glorious process of constant return to yourself, moment after disciplined moment. We must stop searching for a single definition that can capture our complexity. We are beings defined by tension. The tension between impulse and thought, between being and becoming, between acceptance and necessary action. This inherent contradiction is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the very engine of humanity. The weight of this realization can feel overwhelming because it places an immense creative burden upon your shoulders. You are not merely reacting to life. You are designing yourself through life. The choice to observe what passes through your mind, the choice to respond with humility when anger flares, the choice to extend grace when hurt seems deserved. These tiny decisions accumulate, compound, and build a character more enduring than any inherited trait. The truly free human being is not one who has achieved perfect stillness or unshakable virtue. No such state exists in this flawed, beautiful world. The truly free human being is the architect, the dedicated apprentice who knows that, while his current construction may be uneven and imperfect, he will show up tomorrow morning to pick up the tools once more, ready to refine one corner, build a stronger foundation, or simply endure the inevitable storm of life with disciplined grace. Your nature